somebody tells you that, what would you say that the person was trying to say or define? Salvation. Yes, you are correct. Please clap for 2. Right. So his righteousness, right? Jesus. Right. Okay. So the nature of the nature of Jesus' priesthood is one that brings about salvation. That was what this particular passage was. This particular verse was trying to bring out, that the nature of Jesus' priesthood is one that brings about salvation. It is because of his righteousness that we have peace with God. So let's just move to verse 3. So, verse 3. Hopefully, this will all tie in. No, not hopefully, it will. You would understand it in its completeness and wholeness. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so verse 3, it says, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Right? Remember, Melchizedek's nature, not Melchizedek as a man. Right? So, what was he trying to say here? Was he trying to say that Melchizedek did not have a father or a mother? No. So the old, you know that the Bible wasn't really written in English. It was not written in English, right? So the New Testament was written in Greek. Is that correct? Yeah. Greek. Definitely. Yeah. So the New Testament was written in Greek. I always confuse it. I'm so sorry. But like the New Testament was written in Greek, right? In the original text, right? What it actually said there was whose genealogy was not recorded. So Melchizedek was indeed, yes, he was a man. He was the king of Jerusalem, ex-Salem, right? He was a man. He had a father. He had a mother. But it wasn't recorded. And the reason why it wasn't recorded was because of, it wasn't about Melchizedek. There's nothing that about, like, it wasn't about the man. It was the nature of his priesthood that we were trying, that Moses was writing, that the writer of Hebrews was trying to talk about the nature of his priesthood. So when they say that he was without father, he was without mother, he was without beginning of days or end of life, when we're talking about, if we're talking about it based on its nature, it means that the nature of Melchizedek's priesthood was one that was eternal. Like, it was endless. Like, there was no end to his priesthood. Not that Melchizedek as the man, as the priest of God Most High, the priest of God Most High did not die. And just like Jesus, he reigns forever. No, please. That's not what it's trying to say. It's trying to say that the nature of his priesthood, right? The nature of his priesthood is one that is eternal. It lasts forever. There is no beginning. There was no beginning, right? And there is no end. There is no end. And if you are saying that the nature of Melchizedek's priesthood has no beginning, has no end, he was without father or without mother, right? And that is the same as Jesus' priesthood. It means that Jesus' priesthood is eternal, forever, everlasting, continual, always and forever, never stopping, never ending, always, right? That's what it means. That's what it means. So that was what he was trying to establish there, that Jesus was from God. That's in verse 1. Jesus was from God. Jesus' priesthood started from the beginning of the world. In the beginning was God. God there, plural, Jesus, Holy Spirit, and God. It started from there. So, and then the priesthood also, what are the other things we have established? It was from God. It started from the beginning of the world. It is endless, right? It is endless, without end. Yeah. So those are the three things that we have actually established from Hebrews 7:1-3. Right. So now, Hebrews 4. Sorry, Hebrews 7 verse 4. So now just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tithe of the plunder. Yeah. So I think I've already explained this previously. Yeah. So that even Abraham himself, right, he acknowledged the fact that Melchizedek, his priesthood, was from God. And as a result of that, he honored him by giving him the 10th portion of everything that was good. Just, okay, you can go, 5, verse 5. Verse 5. Now, okay. Now the law requires the descendants of Levi who became, okay, don't worry. Let me just read it from here. Now, the law requires the descendants of Levi who become priests to collect a tithe from the people, from their fellow Israelites, even though they also are descendants from Abraham. This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tithe from Abraham and blessed him who had the promise. And without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. Okay. And without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. So can we have, is it possible for me to have like Hebrews like together? Is it possible? Yeah, but can I have that? Oh yeah, thank you. Right, okay. Okay, so here it says that the law requires the descendants of Levi, the descendants of Levi who become priests to collect tithes. Okay, so basically, this was basically, I think I explained a bit of this to us when I said that the tithe that Abraham offered was not one that was of the law. It wasn't as a result of obligation, right? It was voluntary. And you would see that almost there are many places in Scripture where God is trying to reveal to us in many ways how he wants us to operate with him, or how he wants to operate with us, right? You would see that the reason why the law was created was because he wanted to give these people a standard of how to live, right? You would see that even when we come down to Matthew, right? So if you are reading the VHF Bible plan, you would know this. You understand, right? So in Matthew 2, you understand? I'm reading it. Yeah. Anyway, in Matthew 2, I don't know if it's 2 or 3 or 4. Anyway, 2, 3 or 4. Yeah, right. So it says something about Jesus was talking to the Jews, the Pharisees, actually. He was talking to the Pharisees, and he told them that the Pharisees said that, if you are really I can't remember if it was the son of the man but like, if you are really who you say you are, give us a sign. And Jesus was like, you will not receive a sign. Nobody will receive except for the sign of who? Who knows? Who was the person that swallowed by a fish? Abuse the person, right? Right. So even like that, throughout Scripture, you would see that Jesus was tried to, show us my thought process, right? So what I was trying to say by bringing up Matthew 2 was that just like Jonah, that he was in the belly of the fish for 3 days. It was a semblance to, or it was a semblance to Jesus dying and resurrecting. Yeah. So just in that manner. So the law was given to us, to them, right, originally, to show them a standard, right, or a standard of living. I'm directly like this. Even though I'm facing here, I can see you people. Anyway, but like, children of God. Anyway, yes. Please stop distracting me. I'm begging you. Yeah. Okay. So many ways, right? God tried to show. Are you okay? Okay, so in many ways, God tried to show his people the way that he wanted to operate with them in many ways. Right? So in that same, light, he made the law, right? He gave the law to Moses, and one of the laws there was that they would pay tithes to the priest, and that the priest would come from the lineage of Aaron, right? And then Pastor Ida had already established something that I actually did not know about the lineage of why Aaron's lineage was actually chosen. Do you remember what she said? I'm not talking to her. But do you remember what she said? Just say what you remember. Praise, Minister, praise. What do you remember? Okay. So right from scripture was that the people of that particular division, right? Let me call it division, right? According to the law, that they did everything that they could, or they did, right? They sacrificed, they offered gifts according to the law. But this particular priesthood, that's the priesthood of Jesus, right? The nature of his priesthood did not come, right? Did not require any descent of Levi, and we've already established that, right? So it didn't require any or it didn't require him to come from Levi, right? And yes, what else? 7, right? So 7. And without doubt, the lesser, okay, let's start from 6. I can't really see the edges of the kidney. Okay, so this man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promise. And without doubt, the lesser was blessed by the greater. Amen. All right. Okay, so here, it was without a doubt, right, that the order of Melchizedek's priesthood was greater than the one that came from Abraham, the Levites. Do we understand? So that's basically what this whole 4 to 7 was trying to establish, that the priesthood of Jesus, which is of the order of Melchizedek, did not come from, number one, the Levitical lineage, right, by descent. And because of that, it wasn't according to the law. It wasn't according to the law. There was a new order, right? There was a new law, which we would see in, I think, one of the letters of Paul, according to the law of the Spirit, which is now according to the law of the Spirit. But yes. So let's move on. So that's 7. Verse 8. Please, can someone read it for me? 8. Continue. Okay, so 8 says, in this one case, the 10 is collected by people who die. Okay, so right, so we're still talking about the contracting between the Levitical priesthood and the priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, Jesus' priesthood. And we said that in verse 8, this Levitical priesthood, that's in the one case, right? The tenth, is collected by the people who die, meaning that the priesthood doesn't last. It only lasts until one of them dies. So it's subject to death, right? And you would see in the later verses, they were talking about how many people had this priesthood because they died. It wasn't a priesthood that was like Jesus' own, that was eternal, right? It wasn't endless. It was something that was subject to the flesh, that was subject to them dying. So from Aaron to X and Y, as long as the person is going to die, and when that person dies, the priesthood ends. That person's, priesthood ends and over to the next, right? So he says, yes, and in that priesthood, the tenth was collected by people that die. But in the other case, that is in Jesus' priesthood, by him who declares to be living, one might even say that Levi collected the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham. So this particular verse 9 is not really something you should really dwell on, because the writer was just simply say that, okay, so since the Levites, right? Since the Levites or the priests, according to the order of the law, that's the Levites, since they collected the so since they collected the tithes or the tenths, right? Their tenths, the priest collected the tenths, and since Abraham, gave a tenth of everything that he had at that particular moment to Melchizedek, it was like as Abraham was giving everything, the Levites themselves, since the Levites themselves gave to Melchizedek. That was basically what he was trying to say. But that number from the start of verse 9, one might even say he's just trying to like, how will I explain this? He was just drawing a parallel, right? He was just drawing a parallel that, so Abraham acknowledged these people. So one might even say that the whole Levite priesthood, they acknowledged Melchizedek's priesthood. So, and it's just an afterthought. He was just saying it, right? And let's go to 11, right? Okay. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law. Okay, please, Minister Priest, can you read it for us?
If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law given to the people established that priesthood, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in order of Melchizedek, not in order of Aaron? For when the priesthood is changed, the law must change also.
Thank you. Okay, so if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, why was there a need for another one to come? You will notice that it started with an if. So meaning that the writer was trying to say that perfection could not come from that priesthood. And that is why there was a need for another, right? So he started with an if perfection came. And this perfection is also, it ties in line with, the perfection there means salvation, actually, right? And I would explain in further details, right? And you'll see it's in the verses to come, right? Why I said that it means salvation, right? Perfection. So if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law given to the people established that priesthood, why was there a need for another priest to come in the order of Melchizedek and not in the order of Aaron, right? Why was there a need for a priest to come? Why was there a need for a priest to come in the order of Melchizedek according to the nature of that particular priesthood? And it's simple. It is simple because, first of all, the order of Aaron's priesthood was, I think I wrote certain things down. The order of Aaron's priesthood was something that was subject to death, number one. Perfection is something that is complete. Aaron's priesthood would come, go. There was no something that is complete, and that's why I said it is salvation, actually. Something that is complete is something that it lasts forever. It is on by itself sufficient, right? So it is by itself sufficient. And when you are saying the order of Aaron, you are saying that, and if you say that the order of Aaron was sufficient, you are saying that, okay, so when Aaron was when Aaron's descendants were priests, when they were priests, as one person was a priest, it was enough was enough to save the people of the Israel, the people of Israel. But it wasn't enough, because you see that they would do this thing continually. They would operate in that priestly order continually. And what I mean by continually is that they would need to give sacrifices almost every day. And then the high priest would go to the holies of holies every year. I'd be once every year. Like it was not enough. It wasn't enough, because this priestly order was subject to death. It was a fleshly order. It was as a result of the law of Moses. And the law of Moses in of itself is good because it was established by God. But it was not enough to bring about the perfection of the saints. Right? It wasn't enough to okay. So when I say salvation, I'm talking about okay. So what is salvation? I think I should start there, so that we can understand why somebody going to the tabernacle for us to sacrifice, and he would die, and then another person takes over his place, was not enough. What is salvation? There was a reason why God had to, bring Jesus in the first place. And that was because man had fallen short. Like, he was unholy. Like, that's the reason why even the priests themselves had to make sacrifices for themselves before they entered. And if they didn't do it the right way, death or maku, they would just die. And that's one another reason why they would just
with InDrive, you can take a ride at your
rope
price.
around them. Right,
Choose
so that
top-rated
just in
driver
case somebody
and
makes
fill
step
your
5
with feelings,
out of 10,
passions,
just
music,
be ringing the bell.
InDrive. Choose a fair price for your ride.
And it seems cruel, but it's not. It is the nature of our God, and,
In this
and
video,
as
we're going
believers,
to talk
we
about
must understand
vector
it that
fields.
God is holy.
I'm going to introduce the big idea. I'm going to
God
show you a
is
bunch of
holy.
examples of where they
And
come
what
up.
he
And we're going to
expects
introduce
from
the
us,
terminology to
even
talk
from the
about vector
beginning of
fields.
time. The
Now,
reason
this
why
video is part
the
of
reason
my
why
larger
the
playlist
first
on
man,
vector
Adam,
calculus. The link to that and all of my other courses are down in the description.
Right. The reason why Adam
Now, I want to
could
begin-
walk in such a fellowship with God before the fall was because Adam was also holy. But man fell.
By imagining
Right.
that I drop a
So
ball.
by nature of that
Now,
fact,
there was a sort of
man could
arrow
not,
which said where was the vector
Man,
going to
I mean
go when
every
I
human
released
being,
it from
not
rest.
just
It went
believers.
straight down
Man,
from my
everybody
perspective.
could not
But
behold.
if you're on the opposite
They-
side
they
of the
couldn't-
world from
they
me,
couldn't be in the
then
presence
the
of God
direction
anymore. They were
your
literally
ball
cut off.
travels is very different than
And
the
because of
direction that my ball travels.
Years
So
later,
what you can sort of
or decades
imagine is
later,
that
I don't know.
anywhere that you might be, either
Years-
on the surface of the
Yeah,
earth or
kidding.
indeed
But like,
anywhere in the solar
years later,
system,
God had
if
to
you take a ball and
establish,
release
the
it from
law,
rest,
and had to
there's
establish
an
the
arrow.
tabernacle and
It's
everything
the
to
arrow
show
that
them
says
that this
that is the direction in
this
which the
is
ball is going to
actually
fall
how
due
it's
to
supposed
gravity.
to be.
That is the idea of a vector
That a
field.
holy
It is
person,
an arrow
in quotes,
that tells you what's
because
going to
even the
happen
people that were
at every
making
single
sacrifices were
spot.
not really holy. That's
Let
why
me
they
give
had
you
to
a
make
different
sacrifices
example.
for themselves.
This
Would
is a
only a holy person,
standard
only a
plot
person that
of
is
wind
righteous
speed.
would be
I
able
sure feel
to
like a weather
enter
person right now
my
where I'm
presence.
standing in front of a
Tabernacle,
green screen and I've got a weather map
represented
behind
the
me.
presence of
But
God.
nevertheless, what this shows is
His
that at
dwelling
every
place.
spot,
So
there is
only
an arrow,
somebody that is
and that
holy
arrow
would
indicates
enter
the wind
presence
speed.
of God.
This happens to be a
So
map at
there
a
needed
particular
to be
point of
someone,
time for a tropical
right.
cyclone.
There needed to
But
be
it has
someone
that same
that
feature
would
of dropping the
compete,
ball,
that
where at
would-
every spot there is an arrow, and the arrow is indicating what is going on at that spot,
So-
whether it is a wind speed or whether it is the
scratch what I
direction
said.
in which the ball would fall due to gravity.
But
Something
man
like
had
this,
to be holy.
where you want
Had
to
to be
give
holy
a magnitude
for
and
him
a
to
direction at every
be in
point in
the
space,
presence
are
of God.
called vector fields.
So when salvation
So with a little bit
came,
more precise mathematical terminology,
because
what I
God-
might
or because
say
man
is that a
wasn't
vector
holy,
field is just
right,
a
we were
function
subject to the wrath of
from
God.
Rn
to his,
to Rn. It's
And,
something with an
yes,
input domain, so at
God
every
is
point in
angry. God
space,
is
perhaps
angry
R2
with
or
his
R3,
creation,
then
right?
you get an
it's
associated
a hard pill
output,
to
which is
swallow.
also an R2
But
or
the
R3.
God of love
Standard examples
was
would be n equal to 2 or 3.
angry with
So,
us
for
at
example,
some
in
point.
2 dimensions, your function
But he
is
also
going to have a
loved us.
2-dimensional output. It's going to have an
Because it was
I-hat
the
and
same
a
one
J-hat
that
component.
sent his
And the
son to die for
standard
us.
terminology
So
is
it's
we'll
not that
put
God is
m
evil,
to
and then
signify
Jesus
the
is
function, the
just
m of
like-
xy, that's what's going on in the
No.
I-hat, and n,
that
the
God is-
function
God
that's
loves
going to
us,
go on in
right?
the J-hat.
And
So
because of that,
basically your big
he
function
sent his
f can
son.
be
'Cause he-
decomposed
it was a
into
feeling of a
this
father just wanting
component in
to
the
be
I-hat
with
and
his
this
child.
component in the J-hat. Likewise, it
can't
could
be
be
with you.
three-dimensional, which would also be very standard, in which case the
You
standard
the
terminology
plates,
for the three
when
component
you're
functions
done,
are m, N, and
Me
P.
and Nigeria.
So, for example, in
I
that
can't be
plot
with you.
of wind speed that we had before, that was a
That plane
two-dimensional
ticket
plot. And
was
at every
Jesus.
location in the XY plane, there was a
So
two-dimensional
for us
vector, and that vector told
in
you
the first
the wind
reply to
speed
my
at a
father,
particular point.
Jesus
Wind
had
speed
to
of both the
come.
direction
Someone
and a
holy.
magnitude. Nevertheless, you
without
could
fault.
encode that with
Someone
these
that was not
functions
subject to
m
death.
and n. And then
Someone that
a
was
lot of
right,
the G
not by
from
his
calculus
deeds.
just comes along with these functions. So, for example, we might say a vector field is
Someone that was right
continuous
was-
if the m, the n, the p are continuous. Or we might say
Matters.
that a vector field is
Yes.
differentiable if the m,
Someone
the
that was
n, and the p
righteous.
individually are differentiable functions.
Someone that would
Now what I want to do
stand
is
in that gap
actually
forever.
draw by hand a particular
Between
vector
us
field.
and
I'm going to
God.
draw the vector field y in the I hat and
The
minus
eternal
x in the
priesthood.
j hat.
that
And
was the person
so
that
what I'm
could
going to
come
do
and
is just
bring about
plug
perfection.
in various values of x
That
and
was the
y
person
and
that-
see what vectors I get.
that is
So
needed.
for instance, if I take
For
the
us.
vector field and I plot it at the point
Right.
0, 0, then
That
I'm
was
just going to
needed.
get the vector 0,
And that was
0
why-
out.
and that is why
so I can represent
Jesus'
that by just putting a
priesthood
little dot right at the
is
origin
by
of the
far
location 0,
superior.
0.
So that would
If I come here and do the vector field at the point, say,
Aaron's priesthood
1, 0,
could not
then
save
by
anybody.
plugging that
It was
into
according
the
to the law.
yi hat
And as I
minus
said, the
x
law
j
was
hat,
perfect.
then this
Sorry,
is going
the
to
law
give
was
me the
good
vector
in itself.
0 in the I hat
But
and minus
Yeah,
1 in the j
okay.
hat. So how do
the
I
law was
plot
good.
this? Well,
Right.
I first
there.
go to the
Thanks.
location of
Okay,
1, 0, which
the
is
law was
1 to the
good.
right and 0 down. But
The law was
then
good.
I have to draw a vector which is 0
But-
to the right and minus 1 down. So I draw the vector that comes straight down and looks a little bit like this.
Okay, the
So
law
that
was
is me
good.
drawing the
But
vector
because we are
at the
subject
location 1, 0.
to sin,
The vector
right?
itself is the vector
Man.
0, minus 1.
Right.
We could keep on doing these. How about instead
What
I
that law
figure out
did
what happens
was
now
just
at,
to
well, I don't know,
what that
1,
law
1
could
instead.
do was just to
In
show
which
us
case,
that
if I
oh,
plug it into my
this was God's
formula, then
standard
I'm
and
going to
we
get
were
1
falling short of
and
it.
minus 1. Well, how do
we
I
had
draw
no power
this?
to allow
So
us
for
to
the f of 1, 1,
or
I
help
go
us
up
to,
to the location of x, y equal to 1, 1.
fulfill it.
And then I draw a vector
was what
which is
Jesus did.
1 to the
And
right
that is by-
and 1 down. And it
and that
looks
is
like
why,
this vector right there.
As many of us that
And
are
we could keep doing this
You
as
know,
much as we wanted.
but I'm
Why don't we do just
wondering
one
if-
more here and see what happens? I'm going to do the
Yeah,
spot that starts right
but I'm
up here.
wondering
I'll
if we
start
can
and do
still,
0, 1.
you know,
It's always nice
be
to
with God
combine zeros and plus or minus 1
doing
is
things
sort
that
of the
we
standard
engage
test points.
ourselves
Either
with.
way, I put this in,
Or
and what
the-
it starts with is going to be the
what
y
we
value,
have-
which is 1, and then minus the x value, which
You know,
is
we have
0.
done
And so this
our
is a vector
actions,
that goes
right?
1 to the right and
So-
0 up. So 1 to the
right.
right and 0 up goes there.
That is why
Now, you could keep
can-
doing this. You could keep on adding new points and plot them
I don't want
around.
to-
And,
I don't
for
want to
example,
do this.
I'll just do a few of them. I've checked it. You can see that this one's going to go
But
over
in simple
there.
truth,
This one's going to
when a
go
man
over
is
here.
saved,
And if you keep doing this,
The
you
very
notice
nature
that there's
or the
sort of a
very-
bit of a sort of
virtue of the fact that
circular
he's no
type
longer,
pattern occurring
you
here.
know,
So this
under
is
that
useful to do for a few
law.
points, but it gets a bit tedious.
Right.
So
The law
let's
of the
let the
Mosaic law,
computer
the law-
do the
no, not
rest.
the
Okay,
Mosaic
so
law,
I'm back now, and what I've done is just
He's not
plotted this with the computer opposed to doing it by hand, and that's totally fine. And indeed, what we get is this sort of circular pattern.
Because
Now, when you get a computer to plot a
For
vector
any
field,
person that is
and by the
saved,
way,
right,
I'm going to link down below some simple
by virtue of
plotters
the
so
fact
that
that
you
he
could put in
believes
different types of vector
in the
fields and see what it looks
sacrifice
like.
of Jesus Christ.
There's often choices that are made.
What that
So
means
one thing, for example, is
is
that
that
this looks
come as
pretty
you are,
messy because the
with all the
arrows are sort
baggage,
of
with all the
overlapping.
sin,
And so
all the
one thing that
killing,
you might want to
killing
do
count,
is,
and all of that.
instead of having a vector which we think of as a length and a
Christ,
direction, is
you will not
keep
kill
the
yourself.
direction, but maybe play with the lengths a little bit.
And-
So
and-
this
and
is,
it
for
is funny
example, a
because a lot of-
rescaled version
a lot
of the
of,
same thing. These lengths are not accurate.
a lot of
That is,
unbelievers find
the
it hard,
length of the vector
or
at
a
some
lot of
random point,
a lot
like
of people
2, 3,
that have,
is not
you
the
know, come
length
into
of the
Christ,
vector that would
and
be
they find it hard to
3i
believe that the
minus
things that I
2j.
used to do, I
What
can
it's
stop
done is
doing
it
them.
just
So that's why I
proportionately
just, you know,
scaled
I don't
everything
want to
so that
back
it
away.
just looks a little bit prettier,
I don't
and
think
you
I'm
can
saying
see
this
the
way. Some people
circular
have stolen
pattern
as
a
well.
little bit better. And a lot of plots
But like-
of vector fields end up having
Okay.
these kind of features.
I used to
Similarly, from the perspectives
Actually,
of
I feel like-
computer graphics,
let's say I
there's
used
a
to-
question of density. What I plotted here is that I've divided the domain, the x's and the y's, by integer values.
But like,
So
let's
at every
say
point, like
that I
1,
used
0,
to,
2, 0, 1, 1,
let's
2, 1,
say-
all with integer values,
some parts
I've
of
gone and plotted an arrow. Maybe I wanted
Let's
to
say
see
I
a bit
used
more
to,
density. So now I'm going to double
I
the
used to-
density. That means I'm going to split up,
I used
say,
to
the
engage
x-axis
in
not into integer values, but
Pornography.
into a half,
Let's say I
1,
used
1.5, 2,
Right.
and so on.
And when I come,
And so it
when I
just
become a
plotted way
believer,
more
I find it
arrows. I mean, I
difficult
could
to
plot
believe
even
that
more than this. It would
just
just
because
depend
I
on my
believe
density.
in
That's a
Jesus
choice about my
I
computer
would
graphics,
somehow
not a choice about the underlying vector field. Okay, so this was one.
stop.
Let's just take one more. This is just
You
one that I
will.
think is kind of pretty. It's
Well,
sine of
okay,
xy in the I
chance.
hat and cos of x minus y
What,
in the j
what's
hat.
your-
And as you
your
can see, they
place
just
in
get
Christ?
kind of interesting
How it
with a
is
little bit of
different
length
from
scaling and density
the
adjustments. You can make these
Jews
really
or
pretty
the
plots. And so often you
Israelites
play around with these features just
is
to
that
get it to something that you can visualize
now
nicely.
Jesus,
The
in
next
Christ
vector
Jesus,
field that we're going to do is the
you are
vector
free.
field x I hat plus
what that means
y
is that
j hat.
as a
And
believer,
this one, I'd actually
continually-
encourage you to pause the video and
as you
see whether you
continually-
can
because
quickly
it's not
sketch it
magic.
yourself using the
It's not
methods we've
just
done
when
before.
you enter Christ.
However, if you don't wish to pause
you
and just
stop-
want to enjoy
no.
the show, well,
Right.
then
It's not
what
magic.
it looks like
what would happen
is
for
just
you is that
this.
as you continually
Sort of looks
to
like a starburst. Here, by the way, I
seek
haven't
the face of
applied
God
any length
in
scaling,
prayer
and I'm using this
in
integer
the study of
density
the
that I
word,
started with. But it kind of looks like the
happens is that the power
starburst.
of the
Basically, at any point,
transforms
say
you.
1, 1, then the vector, which is also 1,
what that
1, is
means
just
is
sort of
that
pointing
desires
straight outwards. And the reason I'm showing this one
become
is if you can sort of see that
less and
starburst
less
behavior
of
that's
what
happening with this vector field,
you
I can
want.
do the same thing in
what
3
God
dimensions. This is what it
It's
looks like.
automatic.
It's a 3-dimensional
As
plot
long
now,
as you are
and now
playing
this is the
with
vector
the
field
word.
xi hat, yj
It
hat,
is.
and zk hat. So it's got 3 components.
It is actually.
And then what I get is a
In
3-dimensional
case you don't
vector
believe me.
at every point
Right.
in 3 dimensions. And
It
again,
is.
it kind of looks like this burst sticking
that
out
is what
from
you have
the
in
origin.
Christ.
So indeed,
That
you
is
can
why
plot
his
2-dimensional or
priesthood
3-dimensional
is
vector
better
fields,
than
and again, I'll put a
the
link down
priesthood.
below to a
Because
plotter for a
the law that
3-dimensional vector field if you
the,
want to play around
Jews,
component
sorry,
functions away
the
from,
Jews
say, the
had-
x, y, and z that I have here.
They couldn't fulfill
Now,
it.
while we're on
Right,
that
that's why they
theme of how you can play
continually
around with the
sacrifice.
computer
But Jesus
graphics a little bit to plot
fulfilled
these,
the law.
I want to go back to that original
Yes.
wind speed vector field that we saw at the beginning
Yeah.
of the video.
Jesus fulfilled the
Because
law for us.
notice it's not
One
just the
and for
fact
all.
that at every point in
So
the
as you
xy
come into
plane,
Christ,
there's
no
some
longer,
two-dimensional vector that tells you the magnitude
See
and
the law as
direction of the
obligation
wind speed.
so that I will not
There's
enter
also
hell.
color in this plot.
But the law becomes
So what's going on with the color
your
here?
second
Well,
nature.
the color is a way to
Because I
signify
hope you know that
easily,
when I mean-
quickly, visually, what the magnitude is. So in this plot, the sort of whiter,
might
pinker
come
tones
to
are
error
ones that have
into thinking
faster wind speeds.
just
Well, going
because we
back
are
from
no
reds
longer
to orange to
under
yellows to
the
greens to
Roman
blues
priesthood,
are
we
progressively
are not
slower and slower
supposed
wind
to
speeds. So you can sort of see that in the
obey the
middle,
law.
this is where that cyclone is going, where it's got the fastest
The
speeds
law of
going on there
Moses
in the
was
middle.
from God.
So you can either color code the background,
good.
which is what's done in this plot, or sometimes
But
you
the
might just
only
even
way
go and color
that
code
we
the
could fulfill
vectors
it
themselves. And this is a really
is
good
if
way
Jesus,
to be able to
someone
visually and
that
quickly
was
see
holy,
what's going on
blameless,
as well.
without
Now,
fault,
previously in single
did it
or
on our
multivariable
behalf.
calculus,
He
you'd
has
often
fulfilled
have the
it.
domain either
So
be a
as we
line
come
or perhaps a
into
plane,
Christ,
and then the
we
codomain,
are
the sort
able
of the target
to
of the
fulfill it.
function, would be some height
that,
above that line or above
that
that
cannot
plane.
stay,
And those
okay.
were the things that we could graph nicely.
We're no longer
However,
under the
for
law,
a
we are
vector
under the law
field,
of the
even with
Spirit. If we are
n
really
equal
under the law
to
of the
2,
Spirit,
so that's a
that is
two-dimensional
spirit,
input
that
and a
is
two-dimensional output,
But like,
a graph would be
it doesn't mean that
four-dimensional, and
the law of
therefore
Moses
is hard
is
to
truly
graph
real.
in that normal way.
means
However,
that we
as
can
we've
now
seen in
fulfill
this
it.
video, we've had this wonderful
Right.
new way to visualize
Yeah.
every point in either the plane or in space. You just draw a vector, you draw an
So I think I've actually
arrow,
explained
and that signifies
even
what's
12.
going to be going
When
on
the
in the
priesthood is
output
changed,
at
the law
that
must
particular
also be,
input
must be
spot.
changed also.
All right. I hope you've
Did I
enjoyed
explain
that
that?
introduction to vector fields. This is just the first
No.
video in a large series of videos talking
Yes.
about vector calculus and playing around with vector fields. I encourage you to check out the link in the description for that entire
But before
playlist.
saying no,
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a like for the YouTube algorithm, because we're all mathematicians here, and we appreciate
Okay,
algorithms
so I
just as
said
much as
that,
YouTube does. If you have a question, leave it down in the comments,
the,
and we'll do some more math, as
okay, I
always,
said it's
in the
actually-
next video.
the other, the ironic
The final
Order.
example we're going to
Right,
do
was
is
under
an
the law of
incredibly
Moses. Meanwhile, we're
important
now
example of
under
a
the
vector
law
field.
of
One that comes
the
from just a
Spirit.
normal
Actually
old
said
scalar
it.
function f of
Right,
x, y, and z. A function from R3 in this
I think I'll
case,
come back to
just
that.
to
I think
R.
there's more to say about
Well,
that.
for such a scalar function, you could take what
Yeah.
we called previously in multivariable calculus
So let's-
the
let's
gradient.
move
The I hat component is the partial with respect to x,
Uh,
the y hat is the partial with respect to y, and the
Okay,
k hat
okay.
is the partial with respect to z.
13.
That is, if you give me a scalar function f from either r2 or r3 to r, then I can give you a vector field, a corresponding vector field given by the gradient of f. The gradient of f is a vector field. And it also has a very nice geometric meaning. So for example, suppose that my function was the function f of xy equal to x squared plus y squared. Then we can compute out what its gradient is, not too bad. Well, the partial with respect to x is just 2x, and the partial with respect to
So,
y is
technically,
just
I have
2y.
said
So
something about
the
this.
gradient is just that. Now, we've seen this vector
basically,
field,
13 and 14
except for the
are
fact that there's a
basically
2 in
saying
both
that,
places, which just
Jesus,
stretches every vector by a multiple of 2.
You know,
This is
whose,
precisely the
priesthood
vector
is
field we
of
saw
nature of
earlier.
Melchizedek did
And
not
so
come
now
from
I can
the
put everything
tribe of
together
Judah.
in one picture.
Yes, we
So
know
this
that.
is my picture
Sorry, did not come from the
for
tribe of
this
the
function.
the Levite.
What we see is the
Levites,
graph of the
right? He
function.
didn't
That's
come
this
from that
blue
tribe.
parabola.
Right. Who of
And then
he
in
of
the
whom
domain,
Jesus
the
spoken of
domain is
Jesus,
the
that's the
xy
Jew of
plane.
They
We get a
came from a
vector
different
field
tribe.
in that domain. And so
And no
I
one from that tribe has
plotted
ever
the
served
gradient
in the
vector
altar.
field in the
It is clear to me
domain,
that the
and
writer of
then
Hebrews
this
is saying, it's clear to me
function
what I'm
above the
saying,
domain.
that this guy was
And
not
as you might
from
recall from
Levi. He
multivariable
wasn't
calculus,
descendant of Aaron.
the gradient
Right.
vector points in
He
the
wasn't a descendant of
direction
Aaron. He was
of
actually from
steepest
Judah.
increase
Right.
of your function.
You got
So
it.
if you're at some particular x and
Oh,
y
yes, he was
coordinate
actually
and you're
from
up
Judah. I know
there
that
on
Moses
the
never said anything
function
about it.
value at
But
that x and y coordinate, you want to know
then
how do I
let's
climb
look
this
15.
mountain represented by this
15
function
is-
as fast as
16.
possible? Where is this function steepest? What direction should I go? You should go in the direction
answer
of
my
the
question,
gradient.
please.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a like for the YouTube algorithm, because we're all mathematicians here and we appreciate algorithm just as much as YouTube does. If you have a question, leave it down in the comments, and we'll do some more math, as always, in the next video. In this video, we're going to talk about the line integral of a vector field. We previously have seen line integrals earlier on in my playlist on vector calculus.
Yeah.
The link to that playlist is down in the description. And when we previously talked about line integrals, we would have some path, and then we had some function that gave us sort of height above every point along that curve. But now we're imagining a scenario like this, where we've got some vector field, and we've got a curve that is moving through the vector field. And if you look at this vector field, sometimes the arrows of the vector field appear to be almost tangent to the curve. Sometimes they're pointing completely away from the curve in all sorts of directions. What we want to try and measure here is some way of capturing the degree to which the vector field goes along with the path of the curve,
So,
and the
same line of
tangents of the
thought.
curve and the vector field
I know
are
that I've
aligned.
told you that
So what
this
does that
person
mean?
I'm talking
Well,
about is
let's
actually
start
from
with a
Judah.
more
Judah,
concrete
right?
example from
And
physics, the concept
Moses never said
of
anything
work.
about it.
Indeed,
It's
you might
also clear
recall
to
that
me
work
at
was
this
defined
point,
to
from
be
all that
a
I've been
force
saying,
times a
that
distance.
someone
It's sort
had
of
to come
an
from that
elementary
same
way of thinking about what
order
the
of
concept of
Melchizedek, right?
work is. If you
It was-
apply a lot of
it needs-
force
yeah.
for a long
It should be clear to
distance,
you that
you've
another
done a
priest
lot of
like,
work.
you know,
The
Melchizedek
standard example
should
of this
appear.
was an inclined plane. We have
One
a block.
who is
The
based
plane
on
is assumed to be
regulation
frictionless,
or any
and
of
the
the law,
block is
but
going to
on
be
the
sliding
basis
down
of
the plane
a power
under
that
the
of,
force of gravity.
a power
It
of
might move,
an
well, a little bit like
indestructible
this.
life, right?
So
An eternal
if we
life, one
analyze
that
what's
is
going
eternal.
on
I'm going
here,
to explain
there's a
the
force
reason
of
why,
gravity on that
you know, the
block that
priesthood
points
that
straight
brings about
down.
perfection
But
had to be
you
one
can
that
decompose that force of
was,
gravity into
eternal,
two different directions.
was
A
forever,
proportion
everlasting.
that is normal to the
Yeah, I already
inclined
explained
plane,
that.
and a
So
portion
declared
which is
that, you're a priest.
tangential
That's
to the
Jesus,
inclined
you're a
plane.
priest
Indeed,
forever
I'm
in the
also
order
going to
of
add a
Melchizedek.
vector which I'll
Okay, so
call t,
18
and this is just
to
showing
20.
what is the direction of that inclined plane. So because the block moved along that inclined plane, the proportion of the force of gravity that was normal is irrelevant. There's no work that's being done in that direction. All of the work that was done was the proportion that was moving in the tangential
18 and
direction.
19.
So how much work is actually being done? Well, if we say that there is a distance d between where the block started and where the block ended up, then what we can talk about is the dot product, the proportion of the force of gravity in that tangential direction. That's the force that we're interested in. It's not the entire force of gravity,
Did I
just the
explain?
proportion of the force in the tangential direction. And that's what a dot product captures. And then you multiply
I
that
don't like
by
this.
the
You know you're
distance
my
d.
twin.
Okay, so
So
pay
you
attention
must
to the
say
fact that our work here was defined to be a force
So you can
dotted with the
just
tangential. And let's
Well, I
zoom
have
back
explained
out to our more complicated situation where I have some field,
Right,
and then I have
okay.
a
So we
curve
have
that
5
is going to be
minutes.
going through that field. And then the question is,
Let's be honest.
what is the work done by that field if I move some particle along that curve? And as we just saw, the answer to how much work done is going to depend on the degree to which this curve is going tangential to the field. So then, the contribution of the field along that little segment ds is just given by the f dot t, that's the proportion of the force in the t direction, times this little ds. If I'm interpreting this as work, then I would say the work done from moving that little ds is this f dot t ds. Finally, I had a much bigger curve, and so if I want to add everything up, I'm just going to integrate it. I just do the line integral of a vector field f along curve c is just given by this integral over c, the same line integral we've seen before. It's just that the integrand is the f dot t and then integrated with respect to ds. So this formula is exactly like the line integral formula we've seen before. Indeed, it's defined in the exact same way. It's just the integrand is different. The integrand is not just an arbitrary function, which is what we've seen before. The integrand is a specific thing. It's trying to capture the influence of the field along the curve, and so the integrand is this f dot t. And so putting the picture back up, we have an answer to the work done if you move the particle along this curve in this particular field. Indeed, I've been talking about work so far in this video, that specific physics concept, but indeed the concept of a line integral of a vector field along some curve is something that applies in many different scenarios. Work is just one of them. So this definition applies broadly. This is a definition we can understand because we previously understood the concept of a line integral. But the question now is, how do we compute it? And as we've seen before, when it comes to computation, we want to see how can I parameterize curve explicitly and then rewrite this formula in terms of that parameterization. Okay, so let's get some labels. I'm going to say I have a parameterized curve. The curve is on some interval t between a and b. And then the curve is going to be a g of t in the I hat, h of t in the j hat, and a k of t in the k hat. The way I think about this is the vector r is a vector that goes from the origin out to the curve. So the origin is in the center of this plot. Then the r of a, so that's sort of the first component on my interval of t, points to the start of the curve. And then the r of b points to the end
So I
of the
just want
curve.
us to
Note, by the way, the curve has a little blue arrow here that indicates the direction that
I'll
it's
just begin
moving.
to ask God.
Indeed, this is going to be very important. When we
part
think
of the
about
message that
curves,
was
we
for
always
me.
want to think about them as starting at one spot and going to
Reveal it to
another
me.
spot. These are sort of
Shed some
directed
more
curves.
light.
They have a direction that you're traveling.
My
And
heart
that's
is
implied
open.
by
I'm
this
here.
choice of parameterization as well.
I'm here for
Okay,
you.
so that's the parameterization for the curve. So now I want to go back to the formula I had. There are several changes I can make. Notice how there's the unit tangent vector t in this formula?
This is the moment that you want to just,
definition of the unit tangent vector t was just that it was the derivative dr ds. So if you have a specific parameterization, you say, well, how much does that position vector change as you increase arc length? That was the definition of the unit tangent vector. And then just by the chain rule, ds, I can replace that with ds dt. So again, with chain rule, the ds's cancel. They don't cancel exactly, but that's the result of the chain rule. And
this
as a
great
result, I can
salvation.
plug this in, and what I get is the
Thank you for
field
the fact that we
just
have heard your
evaluated
word.
now along the curve, so f
Each and
of
every
r of t.
word that has
And then I multiply it by the
Has come to us.
derivative dr dt.
Jesus
That's a
and
dot
Jesus.
product between this field and this derivative.
will
And then
never
all
be
integrated
the
out with
same,
respect to
Jesus.
t, and my limits of integration are in
His
t
words
as well.
that
They
are
go from the
spoken in
a up
spirit
to the
and
b.
life.
So while the
And they
left
cut through
side of this
divided
equation
souls,
is the
but the souls that are
definition,
in
the
doubts
right
today
side
about
of this
salvation,
equation
about
tells me
Jesus, about his
how I
sacrifice.
compute it. It gives me an
Our
explicit
eyes are
way to
open to the
compute
lies
this.
in Jesus' name.
And indeed, we're going to run through a
In Jesus'
concrete
name, I pray.
example computing a vector field
Amen,
along the
VHF.
curve in the next video. But before we end, I want to show you just one more piece of terminology. It's a third way to think about this. If we have this dr, dt, dt, I can just define a
Maybe
new
I'm not.
symbol, which is just dr, just to be a shorthand for that. And so my third way of writing this is the integral along the curve
So I'm
of
looking
f
around.
dot dr.
Right.
And all of these things are the
Looking
same.
around,
It's just different
there's a
terminology.
first
So sometimes you'll see a
Can-
line
can
integral
somebody
written
help me
f
look?
dot
Because I
dr.
can't
Sometimes
really
you'll
see
see it written
this
f dot t ds. Whenever you want to compute it, though, whenever you actually have an explicit parameterization,
first
use
time?
the middle one. This f dot dr
Is that a
dt
third timer?
dt. The middle one is how
That's
you
someone that you
compute
have
it.
never seen before.
Anyways, we just want to be a little bit familiar with being able to alternate between writing things ds or
Maybe
dr or
turning timer?
dt. They all refer to the same thing, just some might be more natural in one context
Okay, so
than
this is the
another.
first time around.
All right, if you enjoyed this video,
so,
please give it a like for the
just a few
YouTube
things about
algorithm.
that,
If
right?
you have a question about the video, leave it down in the comments
know
below,
about you,
and we'll do some more math
But I
in the
have
next
grown
video.
in VHF. That is my testimony. Right, I remember
In this
the
video,
last
we're
first
going to
time
do
I
an
came to VHF.
explicit
The
computation
first time I was
of
teaching,
computing
not the first time.
the line integral of a vector field along some particular curve. In fact, we're going to interpret this in the context of the work done by a vector field on some particle that moves in a particular curve.
For my liking.
Now, in the
Or like,
previous
second-
video in my vector calculus playlist, I'll link the
Okay, let's
entire
say the second
playlist
time
down
I
in the
came to
description,
VHF, it was
we
particularly
came
when I
up with the
was teaching.
general formula for the line integral of a vector
Seminary,
field along
I
a
don't
curve,
know,
or
at that
the
time.
work done.
And then
In this
I
video, we're just going
remember
to be
myself,
computing out an
I
example.
don't think
of
I
it.
had
Now, let's
practically started
so
reading my
what's our
maths.
example? I
I
have
just
some
remember
vector field f of x, y is y I hat plus nothing in the j hat component. And then I have some curve.
Somebody-
It's the standard unit circle
Like,
rotated
if you've ever
around
been under
once
the administration of Pastor
counterclockwise.
Timida,
So let me just first just
what I'm
sketch
talking
what
about.
this looks like, just to get a little bit of an intuitive feel for what's going on. So if I have just my
Wow.
normal xy
Right.
coordinates,
So
what
I've
does
been
this
blessed by
vector
nature.
field look like?
Right.
So
in that
first of
same
all,
way, I believe
there's
that we are
zero
all,
j hat
in one way
components,
or
so
the
all the
other,
vectors are pointing
been blessed by
horizontal.
VHF.
Now, also notice,
Oh,
it doesn't
yes.
matter what the value of the x is,
So in
x
that light,
never
let's
appears
invite
anywhere. All that
people to
matters is the
church.
height. So for example,
Right?
if you are at height
You
1, so
invite people
any
to
point, any
church.
value of x, and then y equal to 1, say
If
this
you
point
don't-
right
if-
here
wait,
at
if you don't
0,
invite
1,
people to church
the
by the
vector
fact that you're
points
not blessed in
exactly
VHF,
1 to the right,
okay,
1 to the
I
right,
have a
1 to the
solution
right,
for you.
and so forth.
You invite people
If
to
the
church.
y value was twice that, say
Because
2, then
it
the
is
vector
you
would also
that God
be
will
of
say,
length 2, and
"Ma,
so forth. So this is a
we are the
vector
people
field
that I
that gets
put on the
longer as it goes up.
Like,
Likewise,
it is
if
you.
the y values were
Right?
negative,
It is
say for example down here,
the-
it would be pointing
the,
off to the left, off to the left, and so
The
on
will of
and so
God
forth.
would only be done
If you're along the axis, maybe I would just draw a dot
if
right
men
there because
would
those vectors are going to have
partner
no
with
length.
God.
Now
his
we
wings
can
are all
focus
made
on the
the same.
curve, which is moving along the unit
if
circle.
you're not
And I
inviting
should
people to
also
church,
specify
it
a
means that
direction.
you don't
I'm going to
love
say
people. Therefore, you don't love
counterclockwise.
God.
Okay,
That's what
so
the Bible
let me
says.
actually go and plot
Right.
this. This is going to look like
Right,
traveling
so you
around
show
in a
your love
circle
for God by
counterclockwise,
loving
and I
people,
put that
inviting
little
them to
arrow at
church.
the end just to
Do you
indicate
understand?
which direction is going, in this case, the counterclockwise direction.
Sorry.
So that's sort
I
of what
can
it
only look
looks
at one
like.
person at a
And
time,
now I
so
want
that I
to
don't
turn to
get
actually
distracted.
computing what the work
Right,
does. So what's the formula? Well,
let's
we saw
invite
this last
people.
class. The formula for the work is
Oh,
the
sorry,
line
offering.
integral
Sorry.
along a curve
We just talked about it
of
too.
the vector field
give.
as dotted with the
Sorry,
unit
yeah, sorry
tangent
about that.
vector ds.
Yes, offering.
However,
Uh-huh.
we then
Yes,
said, well,
offering.
that might be
So
fine
let's
for the
give,
definition, but there's an
God
easy
loves a
way to
cheerful giver.
compute this
And,
if you
from what
have
we
a
just read
given
today, we must give
parameterization. So
number one
the way I'm actually
attribute,
going to compute this
voluntary.
is with the alternate
I shouldn't
formula,
be telling you the amounts to give,
integral
right?
from a
Right,
up
and
to
you,
b
you give God your best
of
because
the
that's acknowledging that
function
He's
or
your
the
source.
field rather
Right.
evaluated at the
It's
position
acknowledging that he's
function.
your
So
source.
f
You do not
evaluated
give,
along
to
r
the
of t,
church,
where r
to
of t is
people.
your parameterization
It
for your
means
curve,
that
dotted with
Temi
the
Nikan,
derivative
everything
dr
that I have is
dt,
my
and then
own.
finally integrated
That's
with
what
respect to
basically
t.
you're saying.
And it's
So,
this formula that I'm going to find particularly
So
useful.
let's give
Now,
generously, and
what
the
do I need
account
to do to
is
actually be able to compute this?
up.
The field I know. If you recall, I have the field
Let's
written there in
give.
the problem.
Me too. I want to give.
But the r of t I do
Right.
not. So I need to figure out how can I come up with this r of t and then subsequently dr dt.
VHP
That
10.
is my big question mark I need to figure out. So, well, this curve, this
So the
r of
ushers
t
are
is the
going around with the
parameterization
baskets.
for my unit circle. So that's my first objective, is to figure out this parameterization for this unit circle. And now, we've seen this parameterization many times before. It's just the normal unit circle. So the parameterization is r of t is
Are we
equal
all
to
giving?
cosine of t in the I hat direction and sine of t in the j hat
take
direction. I don't have to
this.
think very hard about what
Today
it's
I don't
going
have
to be, it's
Hebrew
just one I
stuff.
know.
Yes,
I
everyone will
also
have
will
done jumping
specify, as I
jacks,
always
but
should
like,
do,
I don't have your time
that
today.
this is
So,
between
VHP.
the values of t being 0 and 2 pi. I have to specify those limits of integration. Indeed, they're going to
Next time
become
before
the
family
a and the b in my formula, the 0 and the 2 pi. If I know r of t,
So,
I can
grab
also
someone
compute
by
what
your
r
left or by your
prime
right,
of t
hold
is
their
going to
hand,
be,
smile
which
at
in this
them.
case is minus sine of t, the derivative of cos is minus sine, in the I hat, and then the derivative of sine is cosine of t in the j hat direction. So I'm now able to plug everything into my formula. What is my work? Well, it's the integral from 0 up to 2 pi, that's my limits of integration. Now, the field was just y in the I hat direction. And so the y component along the particular position position vector that I have is just sine of t. So my y gets replaced with a sine of t in the I hat. And then the field also had a 0 in the j hat. I may as well write it explicitly, but you don't have to if you don't want to. Then, got it, with the r product, or the drdt, and so this is going to be a minus sine of t in the I hat plus a
Erase standard, set the pace.
Nevertheless, and then integrate it out with respect to t.
Erase
Okay,
standard,
so this is the
set the
integral that I want to
pace.
focus on, and now it's sort of a computational problem. which is gonna
Join the set we sing.
Integral from 0 to 2pi, I'm not going to change that at all. I have to come together. Let's see, I have a minus sign, so I can have a minus sine squared of t. That is 0 times the cosine of 0. And then finally, an equation for that t. This is a standard.
Very happy.
Cosine squared. There's no trigonometry. We can use 0 up to 2pi of minus, then it's going to be 1 minus cosine of
I am a
integrated expression. The cosine of 2t because it's being integrated over a period is just going to be equal to 0. Nice little tricks. The minus 1 has to integrate from 0 to 2pi, and it's going to give us the value of minus pi plus t worked out by an answer. We should scroll up to the beginning of this one.
yes, I sing.
Let's just imagine going around that circle. Remember, we went around so if this were to come along here and we're at a tangent vector, at the top of it would be going on the left.
Very happy.
Likewise, if we sort of carried on and went down to the bottom here,
Beyond the vessels of honor foundation. Vessels of honor foundation. Good night, everyone.
Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like. If you have any questions about this video, leave them down in the comments below, and we'll do some more math in the next video. In this video, I'm going to talk about line integrals with respect to a particular direction like x or y. What do I even mean by this? So, I want to go back to our first introduction to line integrals.